This video is brought to you by Western Digital. Every drive has a purpose. Video games are big business these days. With bigger budgets, bigger companies and bigger production values, these days successful games are spun off into franchises. Games that continue on in sequels and even prequels. Some of them are mighty successful, rivaling even movies. Others, well, for one reason or the other gets forgotten and are never made again. In this video, I'll tell you my top 5 picks of game franchises that are basically dead. We'll probably never be playing a new game in any of these franchises ever again. My first pick is Age of Empires. Every strategy game fan would probably have played a game in the Age of Empires series at least once in their lifetime. Developed and published by Microsoft, Age of Empires blew up the scope of an RTS, spanning different ages of human civilization in a relatively quick RTS match. There wasn't anything quite like it, and it instantly became a hit. Age of Empires 2 Age of Kings made it a much more focused medieval era game, which basically meant they could expand on the unit types and make the buildings a lot more distinct to the time period. AoE 2 is much more highly regarded as the best in the series. It even got some competitive play. Age of Empires 3 was a much more streamlined game that introduced some concepts like the home city, which never really caught on. Also, it came out in a time when RTSs were not so popular anymore. It didn't have the same following Age of Empires 2 did. It was also the last Age of Empires game developed by the studio that created the series, Ensemble Studio. They were shut down after the release of Halo Wars in 2009. Age of Empires at that point became history. Fear, a first-person shooter mixed with horror elements, a rather unique combination back when Fear first came out. Developed by Monolith, a developer with a proven pedigree developing first-person shooters, it was pretty obvious Fear was latching on to the very popular horror tropes of horror films at the time, such as The Ring. We have a spooky girl with long hair called Alma, who as you play along, you uncover a top-secret research program that delves into the paranormal. It was also a damn good shooter with some impressive physics and bullet time. Fear was impressive, and at that time, it also broke away from other first-person shooters in its multiplayer mode thanks to the use of bullet time. Fear was a huge hit, and for years we had countless mods and a very active community playing the game. Then as the series moved along with Fear 2, things got worse. Fear 2 was a good game, but as with all second games in a franchise, it simply wasn't special like the first. Fear 2 did have some spectacular moments, but it didn't sell as well as Fear. Fear 3 was the death knell of the series. It was contracted to a third-party studio and it showed. It was the weakest in the series. While Fear 3 was in development, Monolith was working on Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. Sure, Fear 3 had some interesting modes, but it depended way too much on the usual tropes that by this third game was already getting stale. It's not out of the question that we get Fear 4 since Monolith is still around and the publisher still owns the title, but if the publisher only thinks about profits, which obviously all publishers are thinking about, the poor sales of the last Fear, I fear, would make the chance of a new Fear pretty slim. We are more likely to get a sequel to Shadow of Mordor than a new Fear game.
This is the Pentagon. A full frontal attack with your strongest forces should render their military center of operation.
Yes. Power shifts more quickly than some people think.
Command & Conquer. Possibly one of the most well-known strategy title that isn't a Blizzard game. In the 90s, we had Blizzard and Westwood Studios as the kings of RTS. Command & Conquer was a technological and gameplay leap from Westwood's previous title, Dune 2. It introduced an unforgettable villain, the bald-headed, ageless Kane, and for the first time for the studio, introduced live-action cinematics to make storytelling a much bigger focus. And it was a phenomenon. The success of Command & Conquer caught the eye of EA, which then acquired the studio. Westwood was never the same studio after that, as many of the main people in the studio left, and the following RTS titles that were developed under the EA stable fared much poorly compared to the first Command & Conquer. The franchise was also spun off into different series. Red Alert, which asked the question, what if instead of World War II we got the Soviet invasion, Einstein is dead, and Ivan's army looms over the world. And then we got the much unloved Command & Conquer Generals, which was the first 3D game in the Command & Conquer franchise. Fans didn't like it since it was a bit of a departure from the franchise, but to be fair, it was a pretty good game on its own right. I'd put the death of the franchise on two games. The first is Command & Conquer 4 Tiberian Twilight, which came out in 2010. It was to be the end of the Tiberian saga, and quite frankly, the end of this series. Because Command & Conquer 4 messed with the RTS formula way too much, but most importantly, it was a mess, relying way too much on unlocks and grinding to lengthen gameplay. CNC4 was a reaction to the popularity of MOBAs, so it had smaller armies and a mobile base, making it about skirmish, completely missing the point of why the original was so popular. CNC4 tanked. Boxes of unsold copies stacked high in retailers. It was a huge blow to the fans of the series and those that loved RTSs. The next was in late 2011 when EA announced Command & Conquer Generals 2 was in the works, using a brand new engine and developed by a new BioWare studio. The development of Generals 2 didn't pan out as smoothly as EA would have hoped. They later announced that the game would be made into a free-to-play game, and after that, they announced they would be changing the name to Command & Conquer. It seemed the development of that game was in a perpetual state of reworking of the core mechanics. In 2013, EA announced that this game was dead because of the feedback from players. They didn't really offer much explanation. While they have said they are committed to continuing the franchise, looking at the state of RTSs, it's highly unlikely we get a proper RTS CNC game. And now a word about our sponsor. So you've been eyeing that brand new game on Steam and then you realize, holy crap, it's 50 plus gigabytes and you're out of hard disk space. Well, let me tell you, these days I never have that problem because I have the Western Digital Black 6TB hard disk. Yes, that's 6 freaking terabytes. The Western Digital Black isn't just all huge capacity though, it is made for gamers. It features a dual core processor that offers twice the processing capability and 128 megabyte cache with WD's dynamic cache technology to maximize read-write performance. I've been using it for a few months now and overall I found it to be much faster than my other hard drives. Now I know it's no solid state drive, but I think you'll be surprised of just how well it performs. I recommend you keep your operating system on a solid state drive and your games on this bad boy, and I'm sure you'll be one happy gamer. And that's why the Western Digital Black is built for gamers, high capacity, high performance. Check out the link in the description of this video to know more about the Western Digital Black. Alright, and now back to the topic. Rise of Nations. If Command & Conquer, Warcraft, Age of Empires were great RTS classics that set new standards, Rise of Nations pushed those standards even further. Inspired by Age of Empires and to a certain extent Sid Meier's Civilization, Rise of Nations' whole modus operandi was to offer gamers the depth of a 4X and the action of an RTS. After all, the lead designer of Rise of Nations was Brian Reynolds, a main figure in the development of the classic turn-based strategy game Sid Meier's Civilization 2. It seemed like a daunting goal, but the beauty of it was they managed to pull it off. Rise of Nations had borders, multiple cities, research that allowed you to age up, and a supply mechanic, a choke full of strategic options. Now, I know what you might be thinking here, but Rise of Nations isn't a franchise. And you're technically right, there was never a Rise of Nations 2, but there was Rise of Legends. The The developer Big Huge Games, after Rise of Nations, chose not to do the expected, but decided to surprise fans with a fantasy steampunk spin-off. Rise of Legends was a much more streamlined game. A single structure replaced the need to have a sprawling city. It also added heroes. It also probably cost the studio and Microsoft, the publishers of the game, quite a bit of resources, as it featured some rather cutting-edge graphics at the time, which led to a lot of gamers with lower specs to not be able to run the game in its optimal form. Sales were lukewarm, and the studio never got to make another Rise of game. In fact, the studio didn't get to make any strategy game after that. Big Huge Studios shut down after the mediocre RPG Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning. The studio was a victim of way too many acquisitions from THQ, then moving on to 38 Games, and after that Brian Reynolds reacquiring the name of the studio, and they now make mobile strategy games instead. While Microsoft, owners of the franchise, has contracted Skybox Labs to do the HD version of Rise of Nations, developing a brand new game would require a bigger pool of resources and an experienced team behind. Something Microsoft or any other publisher would be hesitant to do these days. Finally, it would be criminal of me if I didn't mention this last game, Dungeon Keeper. One of the first games to put the focus on evil, and boy was being evil really fun, and one of those classic games that is in the EA vault of old games we aren't going to develop anymore, other than an abhorrent mobile version that is rife with wild free-to-play mechanics. Dungeon Keeper is basically in a place no game should be in. The owner of the franchise has no interest in making a proper sequel, the studio that made it no longer exists, and the creator is in a new studio which isn't actually doing too well themselves. Dungeon Keeper was one of Peter Molyneux's finest moments, and if you're a strategy gamer like me, it was his best strategy game by a mile. After Dungeon Keeper, Peter Molyneux left Bullfrog to found Lionhead Studios. Dungeon Keeper 2 came out 2 years after the first and was a safe sequel, carrying over much of the mechanics from the first game, expanding some of the monster interactions, and using a brand new 3D engine. Dungeon Keeper 3 was in the works, but it was cancelled and Bullfrog was merged into AA in 2001. There's been a few attempts at making a spiritual successor or a Dungeon Keeper inspired game. Most of them just couldn't capture the magic of the original classic. Obviously, there are more than these 5 games that we'll never get to play again. If you have a favorite that isn't in this video, share them with me in the comments below. Thanks for watching. This is Frags. Have a fragtastic day. Bye bye.